I have been listening to you and seeing your posts on Facebook and just hearing the discourse, as many have a variety of emotions in the wake of elections on Tuesday. And I am so glad that the scriptures this morning are so reassuring and so clear and so powerful. The psalm with which we began this morning in that call to worship invites us to remember who we are and whose we are. Hear the words of the psalmist. Make a joyful noise to the Lord. Was it a joyful noise we were making this week? Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into God's presence with singing, and that you are doing, singing, lifting up. Know that the Lord is God. We gather to worship each Sunday precisely for that reason. No. Whatever else is going on in the nation, whatever is going on in the world, whatever is unsettled about our hearts or our souls, the psalmist says, be sure of this. The Lord is God. The Lord alone is God. It is God who made us. We are God's people. We are the sheep of God's pastures. Our scriptures remind us this morning who is in control, who reigns over heaven and earth and all authorities before or coming. The Lord is God. It is God who made us. We are God's. God is our shepherd, the one who provides for us, the one who will care for us, the one who will hold us in his arms and protect us. Isn't this good news this morning? Just to sit in God's presence, to know that God is caring for us, and that God will provide all things. Our scriptures invite us to go a few steps beyond just this sense of great assurance and comfort in God's care. It asks us just to remember who God is. In Deuteronomy, the people have begun to settle in this beautiful, fertile land that God has given them, this land flowing with milk and with honey, and they begin to forget who God is. They forget who is providing the land, who is the giver of the soil and the rain and the abundance. They begin to fight with each other. Their hearts get distracted and they become ungrateful. They become divided and begin to kind of wander away from the Lord. And as they do so, they're disgruntled and afraid and frustrated. I'm talking about people a couple thousand years ago, right? Not any of you. But the author of Deuteronomy and encouraging God's people, he says, just remember who God is. Just remember who God is. Remember that it is God who first brought you out of slavery. Remember that it is God who parted the Red Sea and allowed you to walk through what seemed to be impossible. Remember that it is God who literally fed you water from a rock and bread from heaven as you wandered in the desert places. Remember, it is God who brought you to this land in the first place. That remembering causes us to have assurance. That remembering invites us to recommit our lives to God, and it provides for us this abundance of hope, this abundant resource of courage. For the God who brought us into the land is the God who will protect and care for us in the land. The remembering humbles us and elevates a graciously providing God. Remember, as the psalmist said, we are God's people, the sheep of his pasture. This week, as many of you are aware, I got to spend some wonderful time at home. While Frederick has been my home for 15 years, home always feels like Creekbound Farm in Hagerstown. I got to sit with my grandfather as he is still in his last days. Life can be persistent. And I got to sit with him, especially on Wednesday, as the rhetoric was flying in our nation and so much was unsettled. All the technology was turned off, and I got to sit with him and look out the window. My Pap's window looks out over the fields of the farm. Most of us are somewhat removed from agriculture at this point. It always does my heart good to sit and look out the window, or better, to walk through the fields. There were combines in the fields, and they were harvesting the wheat, and you could watch the abundant harvest blow from the combine into the truck. And I was just reminded, as the psalmist said, as the author of Deuteronomy encourages us, remember that all you have is a gift from God. I was much more certain of that as a child growing up on the farm. All we had is a gift from God. The soil, the ground, a gift from God. The nutrients provided there, a gift from God that enables our food to grow. The seed, a gift from God to be planted. The rain that causes those wheat seeds to germinate and rise up into a harvest, a gift from God. Much of what we see and touch does not look like grain and bread. Our smartphones might seem far removed from those agricultural roots. We can become independent, feeling ourselves to be self-made, not God-given. But at the core of everything we have is an agricultural product. Somebody grew it. Somebody mined it out of the earth. The heat that's pumped into this room, coming up for us out of the earth. Everything we have, at its core value, is a gift for us to harvest, for us to see and enjoy. And not only the tangible, but the very ability to work, a gift from God. As we looked out that window on Wednesday, watching the combines and watching the trucks, my grandfather, a man of few words in these days, said, "I wish I could drive that truck." The people driving those trucks are tired. They've been driving those trucks 24 hours a day, it seems, for the last 2 months. That's what you do in the harvest season. Perhaps some of you out there are a bit weary by your work. Long hours are causing you to be tired. Think of Grandpa. I wish I could drive that truck, right? The ability to work, the energy to work, and not just in your day jobs. For many of you are blessed to be in the season of retirement, though somehow you work harder than I do. And you're all shaking your heads. You're working to contribute to your family. You're working to contribute to your community. You're working to contribute to your church. The ability to be productive is such a gift. Is such a gift. All that we have, according to the psalmist and the authors of Deuteronomy and on through the gospel lessons, we're reminded, all that we have and all that we are, our very breath, a gift from God. And so the scriptures call us on to remember who we are and whose we are, and then to celebrate the abundance, to celebrate who God is in the midst of us. It's not just what God gives, but who God is. That God is our creator, the giver of life, that in Christ God is redeeming us, God is loving us, God is forgiving us, God is inviting us into blessed community. We are to remember and we are to celebrate. I got to listen to the radio a bit on Friday. It was Veterans Day, as many of you have recalled. But the rhetoric on the radio was not about Veterans Day. And I listened to that radio as I was holding my grandfather's hand, a veteran, and I said for the first time, "Pappy, thank you for serving." And I'll say that to those of you that serve our nation in any capacity. Thank you for serving. We are challenged to be people that celebrate what God is doing and celebrate as sacrifices are made. In our bickering, we use up words that could be better used to celebrate what is good and what is honorable and what is true. We are invited to remember and to celebrate. That's why today is so refreshing. As Tina said, there is a different kind of spirit in this house. Well, that's because here we're unified and we're celebrating what is hopeful and what is true and what we know is possible as we serve God in a unified front. We are invited to remember. We are invited to celebrate. And then in the words of Deuteronomy and in the words which Christ puts before us, we are invited to return to the Lord a generous portion. Those words from Deuteronomy say, once you enter the land that the Lord your God has given you. We pause this morning to say, this is the land that the Lord our God has given you. This is a land that flows with milk and honey. It is abundant in natural resources and abundant in human wisdom. Once you enter the land the Lord has given you, take some of the early produce. Take some of the first and the best crops that your land produces, the very first, the very best of what you receive. Put it in a basket and bring it to the Lord. I can remember from my childhood days harvesting a garden. Did any of you garden in your lifetime? No strawberry is as good as the first strawberry, right? No potato is as good as the first. Some of you are wrinkling your nose. Those garden potatoes are good, especially early in the season. They're not like these wrinkled things that come out of the supermarket. They are good. There is no apple like the first apple. It says, as soon as your land begins to bring forth its goodness, joyfully, with excitement, with celebration, put it in your basket and come running to God to say thank you. This is our invitation as believers, and I believe it's not an obligation, but it is a privilege, it's an honor, it's that which instills joy in us to put in our baskets the very best of who we are and what God has equipped us to become, to put in our baskets our very best gift and to bring it to God. This week, because it's a season of grieving in my family and I haven't felt particularly well, my family kept saying, Jenny, why don't you not preach this weekend? I'm sure there's someone else that can do it. And I thought that over and I said, no, I love this weekend. It's one of my favorite weekends to preach. And so my family said, oh, what are you preaching on? And I said, well, I'm preaching on Thanksgiving. And I love centering us in gratitude. And I'm preaching about tithing. And my family said, oh, yeah, you should let somebody else preach. That, they don't really need to hear that. And sometimes we feel that way because it makes us a little bit uncomfortable. And we size up our ability to bring a joyful gift unto the Lord. But the Deuteronomy passage is so helpful, and I invite you to read it and to reflect on it. I want to read a little farther than where was read by George. We read the first 11 verses, and in those verses, the people are just getting started with God. They're planting their first fields. So what they're bringing is kind of their emotional response. Yes, I have something to give. I can remember that kind of response. My first job, I got for the first time to write a check to the church. And I was so excited to be able to do that. I was so excited that something I could do could connect with what God is doing. But Deuteronomy reminds us that as we grow up, as we mature, it's not just that first, I'm going to bring God the first and best apple, but figuring out how this spirit of generosity, figuring out carefully how our commitment to return to God a portion of what he has given really becomes a part of the rhythm of our lives, really becomes a part of what motivates us to work every day. Here, as the people settle in, how God continues to challenge them to return joyfully a portion to the Lord. In the third year, the year of the tithe, when you finish paying your full tithe, give it to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, the widows, so that they may eat their fill in your town. Then as you bring your offering, you will say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from my house. I have given it to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, the widows, in accordance with your commands. I have neither transgressed nor forgotten your commandments. I have not eaten your portion, not even while mourning. I have not removed any part from your portion while I was unclean. I have not offered it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God, doing just as you commanded me. Look down, God, from your holy habitation. Look down from heaven and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our ancestors, our land flowing with milk and honey. Have any of you started a small business in your lives? A couple of you, yeah, I know, there's a couple out there. Dennis Wallace, Wally. How did Wally Ironworks do the first year? Was it a bumper year? Yeah, right? God gets that. I love the scripture this week. It popped out to me. You know, I grew up on a farm. My parents talk about the first decade of farming and just the struggle to make ends meet. And many of you have lived that in your careers, starting out. Your first job, probably ends barely met. Still, maybe it's a struggle. The Lord said the tithe would begin in the third year because it takes 3 years for fields to accumulate the nourishment to have a substantial harvest. God knows that it takes some time for us to get to a place where we can bring a tithe. It takes some time to build up our ability to bring his full portion. And I love that about the scriptures because it understands the difficulty, the practicality of getting to a place where we can make a substantial gift. I still want to tell Lucas's story, but are you talking in a few minutes? Okay, Lucas will tell you his own story. I can't, he told me at 8:30, you took everything I had to say. I'll let you tell your own story. No. What I believe God is inviting us to do, some of you are already tithers, meaning you're already giving 10% of your harvest, 10% of your income to God's work through the church. And I celebrate that. And some of us are at a place, some of you are at a place where you say, 10%, that's huge. Perhaps this is the first time your ears are hearing that challenge in a way that makes sense to you. God understands that that leap may not be able to be accomplished immediately, but it's something that we work towards diligently with the goal that eventually this whole sacred portion, and I've come to appreciate that so greatly, that this whole sacred portion can be given to God, that a whole 10% can be offered to God for the work of the church. And what I have seen time after time is as families work to be able to give that sacred portion, God becomes increasingly the center of who they are and what they do. It's not the only way, but it's an important way. When we say 1 out of every $10 is going to God's work, it means we have to carefully think about how we spend the other 9. We carve out that margin, the creation of the sacred within our budgets. So it means that when you go to work and you work through the day, 1/10 of that energy, 1/10 of what you produce in that day becomes sacred because the outcome of your working, your income, will be God's. When we are out farming, we think of all of our work as sacred work. We're feeding God's people. I encourage you, especially this week, to think of all of your work as sacred work. Whatever you do, you can do it for the Lord. Whatever you produce, you are producing it for God's people. Whatever you do to serve, perhaps you're a teacher, or you work in an industry, your work is a part of God's work in the world, in community. Now, if you think about that and your stomach gets a little sick, and you realize, wow, the work I do is not farthering God's work, then maybe your 3-year plan is, I got to figure out how who I am is aligning with God's work in the world. But for most of you, what you already do can have holy purpose, the entirety of it. But particularly as we design our budgets, and it is hard work, God knows that. It's here in the scriptures. As we work towards the tithe, all of our money takes on a sacred nature. All of our resources takes on a holy purpose. My kids will tell you quite often we say, well, we can't afford that. And that is a healthy thing to say to children. It's a healthy thing for grown-ups to say to each other. We can't afford that. And we have come to appreciate in our family, and I invite you to bring it into the conversation of your family, that a part of why we're not doing that is so that we can tithe. Is so that our first priority in all that we are, including in our budget, can be God's work in the world. And that's a holy shift for many of us. The way I am working, the way I am saving, the way I am budgeting, that all of it is becoming holy work. Jesus says in the gospel lesson, do not work for that which does not satisfy, but work for that that has eternal value. I pray that whatever work you do in your day job, in your serving of family and community, I pray that you can find the eternal holy value in the way you invest your God-given energy, your God-given talent and wisdom, God-given breaths and days. And I encourage you to see the harvest, to see the income as an opportunity to invest in that which satisfies. In closing, I would like to just say how grateful I am for the ways our church has matured in this decade. It is a blessing to read your testimonies. It's a blessing to read the packet the finance team put out, because it just shares how lives are impacted every day by who you are. As you work and as you give, know that you are working and giving for ministries that matter. They matter to the newly baptized, who are testifying to how all of life has changed. They matter to the children who grow up in this church and become lifelong believers and contributors in their community. They matter to youth who literally find their best and only sanctuary here. They matter to adults for whom this is community, this is fellowship, this is family. And they matter especially to those that we serve in the neighborhood. We have watched a transformation in this decade. If you ask just about anyone out there about Mount Carmel Church, they can say something that God has done through you. And I celebrate that transformation. And I encourage us all, especially in these days, to be people who remember all that we are and all that we have is a gift from God. People who celebrate all that is abundant. And people who generously respond by working towards that tithe and giving God's full portion to the work of God in the world. I hope to spend a few days this week looking out the window, and I will be watching farmers seed for next year. Seed for next year's harvest. The image that I leave you with is in the olden days when seed really did just rotate through. When you harvested, you would pull out 10% of your seed and reserve it for next year's planting. as we tithe, as we give to the church, we say, I'm not going to eat all the seed. I'm not going to use it all for today. I'm going to plant it. I'm going to invest so that I get to see what God grows. And that, I trust, will be abundantly beautiful. Amen.